The old community center on Maple Street had been standing for almost 40 years. Its brick walls were faded. The paint on the wooden doors was peeling, and if you looked closely, you could see cracks running along the ceiling like tiny rivers. But despite all of this, the place had a warmth to it. It was where people came together. Birthday parties happened here. Wedding receptions, holiday celebrations, support group meetings. It was the heart of the neighborhood, even if that heart was getting a little tired. In the corner of the main hall, pushed up against the wall near the old radiator, sat an upright piano. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. The wood was dark brown, almost black in some spots where the finish had worn away. The keys were yellowed like old teeth, and several of them stuck when you pressed them down. A few strings inside were broken, so certain notes either sounded wrong or didn't make any sound at all. Dust covered the top of it so thick you could write your name in it. Most people who walked through that hall didn't even notice the piano anymore. It had become part of the background, like the worn carpet or the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. But someone did notice it. Every single day, her name was Margaret Hayes, and she was 67 years old. For the past 15 years, she had worked as the janitor at the community center. She arrived every morning at 5:30, before the sun came up, before anyone else was there. She mopped the floors, cleaned the bathrooms, emptied the trash bins, wiped down the tables, and made sure everything was ready for whatever events were scheduled that day. Then, long after everyone else had gone home in the evening, she would still be there, pushing her cart from room to room, turning off lights, locking doors. Margaret was the kind of person most people didn't really see. She was quiet. She kept to herself. She wore the same gray work uniform every day, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She never complained, never asked for anything, never drew attention to herself. When people did notice her, they might offer a polite smile or a quick thank you, but that was about it. To the world, she was just the cleaning lady. Nothing more, nothing special. She lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment 3 blocks from the community center. No husband, no children, no pets. Her life was simple and routine. Wake up, go to work, come home, eat dinner, watch a little television, go to sleep. Day after day, year after year. Some people might have called it lonely, but Margaret never really thought about it that way. This was just how things were. This was her life. The community center was the closest thing she had to a home, really. She knew every inch of that building. She knew which floorboards creaked, which windows didn't close all the way, which light switches needed to be jiggled just right. She knew the smell of the place, the sound of it when it was empty in the early morning hours. After 15 years, it was familiar. It was comfortable. It was hers, in a way that nothing else in her life had ever been. So when the announcement came, it hit her harder than she expected. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when the director called a special meeting. All the staff members were asked to come, along with the regular volunteers and some of the people who use the center most often. Margaret stood in the back of the room, her cleaning cart parked by the door, her hands folded in front of her. She had a feeling this wasn't going to be good news. The director, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Robert Chen, stood at the front of the room and cleared his throat. He looked like he hadn't slept well in days. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this," he said, his voice heavy. "The center is closing. We've been struggling financially for years, and we just can't make it work anymore. The city is cutting our funding, donations have dried up, and we've run out of options. We have until the end of next month." "I'm so sorry." The room erupted in shocked voices. People asked questions, some angry, some desperate. How could this happen? Where would they go? What about the after-school program? What about the senior lunches? What about all the memories made here? Margaret didn't say anything. She just stood there, feeling something cold settle in her chest. The end of next month. That was only 5 weeks away. 5 weeks, and then this place would be gone. And if the center was gone, her job was gone. But more than that, the one place where she felt like she belonged, even as just the invisible woman with the mop, would disappear. Over the next few weeks, the mood in the building changed. There was a sadness hanging in the air. People came by more often, wanting to spend time there while they still could. They took pictures. They told stories about things that had happened in those rooms over the decades. Someone organized a farewell gathering for the last day, inviting everyone who had ever been part of the community center family. Margaret kept working, kept cleaning, even though she knew each day brought them closer to the end. She scrubbed the floors more carefully than ever. She made sure every surface gleamed. She wanted the place to look its best, right up until the very last moment. It was the only way she knew how to say goodbye. The final day arrived on a Saturday in late October. The farewell gathering started at 2 in the afternoon. People filled the main hall, more people than Margaret had seen there in years. Old faces and young faces, people laughing and crying at the same time. Someone had set up a table with coffee and cookies. Children ran around playing, maybe not fully understanding that this was the last time they'd be able to do this here. Margaret worked quietly in the back rooms, finishing up her duties. She cleaned the kitchen one last time. She emptied the trash bins. She swept the hallways. Part of her wanted to avoid the crowd, to just finish her work and slip out without anyone noticing. That's what she always did. Stay invisible. Don't make a fuss. But as she pushed her cleaning cart back toward the storage closet, she had to pass through the main hall. She kept her head down, trying not to interrupt the gathering, trying not to be in the way. People were talking and laughing, sharing memories. The mayor was there, shaking hands. A few reporters had shown up to document the closing. Someone was taking group photos near the front entrance, and then Margaret saw it. The piano. That old, broken, forgotten piano in the corner. She stopped walking. Her cart stopped with her. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it. How many times had she dusted that piano over the years? How many times had she walked past it without really thinking about it? But now, looking at it on this last day, something stirred inside her, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very, very long time. Her hand reached up slowly, touching her chest, feeling her heart beating faster than it should. Her eyes stayed fixed on those yellowed keys, those broken strings, that dusty wood, and suddenly she wasn't seeing the piano as it was now. She was seeing a different piano, in a different place, in a different lifetime, a lifetime she had buried 50 years ago. Margaret stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Her cleaning cart sat beside her, forgotten. Around her, people talked and laughed and took pictures, but she didn't hear any of it. All she could see was that piano. Her feet started moving before her brain caught up. She found herself walking toward it slowly, like she was approaching something dangerous. Her heart was pounding now, really pounding in a way that made her feel dizzy. When was the last time she'd felt this way? When was the last time she'd felt anything this strongly? She reached the piano and stopped just in front of it. Up close, it looked even more worn out than she'd thought. The wood was scratched and dented. Someone had carved initials into the side panel years ago. The brass pedals at the bottom were tarnished and dull. This piano had been used, loved, and then slowly forgotten. Just like her, she thought. Just like her. Her hand lifted, trembling slightly, and her fingers brushed across the keys. They were cold and dusty. Some of them were chipped at the edges. She pressed one down gently, and it made a sad, tinny sound that was slightly out of tune. She pressed another. This one stuck halfway down and had to be pulled back up. And just like that, she was 17 years old again. The memory hit her so hard she had to grip the edge of the piano to steady herself. She could see it all so clearly, like it was happening right now instead of 50 years ago. The practice room at the conservatory. The big windows that let in afternoon sunlight. The beautiful grand piano, black and shiny, that responded to the lightest touch. The feel of the keys under her fingers, smooth and perfect. The music that poured out of her, effortless and natural, like breathing. Margaret had been good. Really good. Her teachers had told her she was gifted, maybe even exceptional. You have something special, her professor had said. A kind woman named Dr. Lin who wore reading glasses on a chain. If you keep working, if you stay focused, you could have a real career. Concert halls, recordings, the whole world could hear you play. Margaret had believed her. She'd worked harder than anyone else at the conservatory. While other students went to parties or slept in on weekends, she practiced. 6 hours a day, sometimes 8. Her fingers became strong and quick. Her understanding of music deepened. She learned to make the piano sing, to make it whisper, to make it cry. She learned pieces by Chopin and Beethoven and Rachmaninoff. Pieces so difficult that most pianists never attempted them. She'd been on a full scholarship. Her family didn't have money for a fancy music school, but her talent had opened the door anyway. She was going to be somebody. She was going to make something of herself. For the first time in her life, the future looked bright and full of possibility. And then her mother got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then came the doctor visits, the tests, the worried looks on the doctors' faces. Cancer. Advanced. The treatments were expensive, so expensive that Margaret couldn't understand how anyone could afford them. Her father had died when she was 12, so it was just the two of them. Her mother had worked as a seamstress her whole life, but there was no insurance, no savings, nothing to fall back on. Margaret had made the decision quickly, maybe too quickly. She'd dropped out of the conservatory to work and help pay the medical bills. Just for a little while, she told herself. Just until Mom gets better. Then I'll go back. But her mother didn't get better. The treatments helped for a while, bought them some time, but in the end the cancer won. 2 years after that first cough, her mother was gone. Margaret was 19 years old, alone in the world, working 2 jobs just to pay off the remaining medical debt. By the time the debt was cleared, she was 21. Her scholarship was long gone. Her technique had deteriorated from lack of practice. Her fingers weren't as quick anymore. The conservatory had moved on without her, filled her spot with another talented student. She'd tried to play a few times, gone to a music store and asked if she could try their pianos. But every time she sat down and put her hands on the keys, all she felt was pain, loss, grief, not just for her mother, but for the person she herself had been, the future she'd almost had. So she'd stopped. She'd made a choice right then to never touch a piano again. It hurt too much. It reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she'd given up. And over the years, she'd built a life that had nothing to do with music. A simple life, a quiet life, a life where she didn't have to think about what might have been. 50 years. 50 years since she'd sat at a piano with the intention of really playing it. 50 years of silence. But now, standing in this dying community center on its last day, something was different. Maybe it was knowing that this place was ending, just like her dreams had ended all those years ago. Maybe it was the feeling that some things needed to be acknowledged, even if they hurt. Maybe it was just that after 50 years of keeping everything locked away, she was finally tired of carrying it all alone. Margaret looked around the room. Everyone was busy with their own conversations, their own memories, their own goodbyes. No one was paying attention to the old cleaning lady standing by the broken piano. She was invisible, like always, and somehow that made what she was thinking about doing feel safer. If no one was watching, then it didn't really matter, did it? If no one was listening, then she couldn't disappoint anyone. She could just play for herself one last time, in this place that had been her refuge for 15 years. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out the piano bench. It scraped against the floor with a loud screech, but even that didn't draw anyone's attention. She sat down slowly, her back straight the way Dr. Lin had taught her. "Posture matters," she could hear her old teacher saying. "Your whole body plays the piano, not just your fingers." Margaret positioned her hands over the keys, her fingers curved and ready. They remembered the position even after all these years. Muscle memory, they called it. Her body knew what to do even if her mind was screaming at her to stop, to get up, to walk away before she broke her own heart all over again. She took a deep breath, then another. Her eyes closed. And in that moment, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she made a decision. She was going to play, not for anyone else. Not for applause or recognition or anything like that. Just for herself. Just to remember who she'd been, who she might have been, who she still was underneath all the years and the silence and the invisible life she'd built. Just this once. Just this one last time. Her fingers came down on the keys and the first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the air. The first notes were shaky. Margaret's fingers felt stiff, uncertain. They stumbled over the keys like someone trying to remember a language they used to speak fluently, and the piano itself fought against her. Some keys stuck. Others made no sound at all because of the broken strings inside. A few notes came out harsh and jangling, completely out of tune, but Margaret kept going. She pressed through the rough spots, her fingers slowly remembering the patterns they'd learned so long ago. It was like walking down a street from your childhood. Everything familiar but also strange, changed by time but still recognizably the same underneath. The Moonlight Sonata. She'd performed this piece at her final recital at the conservatory, just weeks before her mother got the diagnosis. It had been perfect that night. Every note clean and clear. The emotion building exactly the way Beethoven had intended. The audience had given her a standing ovation. Dr. Lin had tears in her eyes. "That's the best I've ever heard you play," she'd said afterward. "You're ready. You're really ready." Margaret's fingers moved through the opening melody, those haunting notes that sounded like moonlight on water, like sadness and beauty mixed together. As she played, something remarkable started to happen. Her fingers were compensating for the broken piano. When a key stuck, she adjusted her touch. When a string was dead, she found a way to skip that note or substitute another one that almost worked. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was music. Real music. And it had been so long, so incredibly long since she'd made music. Tears started running down her face. She didn't try to stop them. Her eyes were still closed, and in her mind she wasn't in the community center anymore. She was back in that practice room with the big windows. She was 17 again, with her whole life ahead of her, with dreams so big they barely fit inside her chest. She was the girl who believed she could do anything, be anything if she just worked hard enough. The music grew stronger. Her fingers found their confidence moving faster now, more sure of themselves. The second movement began, the one that was slightly more upbeat but still carried that deep melancholy underneath. Her hands crossed over each other, dancing across the broken keys, pulling beauty out of an instrument that should have been silent. And that's when the conversations in the room started to die down. It happened gradually. First, someone near the piano stopped talking mid-sentence and turned to look. Then their conversation partner turned too. Then the people next to them, like ripples spreading across a pond. The silence moved through the crowd. One by one, everyone in that community center stopped what they were doing and turned toward the corner where the invisible cleaning lady sat at the broken piano. Some of them had heard people play that piano before, usually badly. Kids banging on the keys, teenagers picking out simple melodies with one finger. Once, someone who'd had too much to drink at a holiday party tried to play Jingle Bells and gave up after a few notes. The piano was broken, barely playable, an instrument that existed only as furniture. But what was coming out of that piano now was something else entirely. Despite the stuck keys and the dead strings, despite the out-of-tune notes and the jangling dissonance, there was something undeniably powerful happening. The music was raw and honest and heartbreaking. It sounded like loss and longing. It sounded like 50 years of silence finally breaking open. It sounded like a human heart translated into notes. A young mother who'd been bouncing her toddler on her hip stopped moving and just stood there listening. An elderly man who'd been laughing with his friends fell quiet, his eyes fixed on Margaret. The mayor, who'd been getting ready to give a speech about the center's legacy, lowered his note cards and watched. The reporters, who'd come to document the closing, started recording on their phones, instinctively knowing they were witnessing something important. Margaret didn't know any of this was happening. She was lost in the music, lost in the memory, lost in the feeling of her fingers on the keys after 50 years of keeping them still. The third movement now, faster and more passionate. Her hands flew across the keyboard, her body swaying slightly with the motion. The tears kept coming, streaming down her weathered face, dripping onto her gray work uniform. She thought about her mother, how she used to sit in the back row of the practice room sometimes, when she could get away from the seamstress shop, just to listen to her daughter play. How proud she'd looked, how she'd say, "You got this gift from your grandmother. She played too, you know. Not like you, not this good, but she loved music." Her mother had died never knowing what Margaret had given up for her. She'd been so sick at the end, so confused from the medications, that Margaret had never told her about dropping out. She'd just said the conservatory was on break. It was easier that way. Kinder. She thought about Dr. Lynn, who'd tried to stay in touch for a few years after Margaret left. "Come back," she'd written in letters. "There are scholarships for returning students. We can work something out." But Margaret had never responded. Eventually, the letters stopped coming. She wondered sometimes what had happened to Dr. Lynn, if she was still teaching, if she ever thought about the promising student who'd disappeared. She thought about all the years in between. The cleaning jobs, the quiet apartments, the invisible life, the birthdays spent alone, the holidays working while other people celebrated, the slow accumulation of days and weeks and years that had somehow turned into 50 years gone by. Just like that, like water slipping through her fingers. But mostly, as her hands moved through the final section of the piece, building toward the climax, she thought about the music itself. How it had lived inside her all this time, buried but not dead. How even after 50 years of silence, her fingers still knew what to do. How the feeling of playing, of creating something beautiful, felt exactly the same as it had when she was 17. Like coming home. like finding a part of herself she'd thought was lost forever. The final notes came, that descending melody that always made her think of someone walking away into the distance. Her fingers pressed the last chord, and even though two of the notes didn't sound because of the broken strings, it didn't matter. The music had been played. The silence had been broken. Margaret lifted her hands from the keys and opened her eyes. And that's when she realized the entire room was staring at her. Every single person. Complete silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Her heart jumped in her chest. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment. Oh no, oh no. What had she done? She'd made a spectacle of herself. She'd interrupted the farewell gathering. She'd drawn attention to herself, something she'd spent 15 years trying never to do. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to be invisible again. But then someone started clapping. A single person, slow and steady. Then another person joined in. Then another. And suddenly the entire room erupted in applause. Not polite applause, not the kind you give because you're supposed to. Real applause. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and true. Some people were clapping so hard their hands had to hurt. Others were wiping tears from their eyes. Margaret sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands in her lap, unable to process what was happening. Why were they clapping? Why were they looking at her like that? A woman pushed through the small crowd that had gathered near the piano. She was maybe in her early 40s, wearing jeans and a blue sweater, and her face was wet with tears. The woman in the blue sweater came closer, and Margaret could see she was really crying. Not just a few tears, but the kind of crying that shakes your shoulders and makes it hard to breathe. She stopped right in front of the piano bench, looking down at Margaret with an expression that was hard to read. Wonder, maybe, or disbelief. I've been taking piano lessons for 12 years, the woman said, her voice shaking. 12 years. I practice every week. I've spent thousands of dollars on lessons and sheet music and a good piano for my house. And I've never ever heard anything like what you just played? She wiped her face with her hand. Who are you? Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. Her throat felt tight. Finally, she managed to whisper, I'm nobody, just the cleaning lady. The woman shook her head firmly.
No, you're not just anything.
People who are just something don't play like that. She pulled over a folding chair and sat down right there next to the piano bench, like she wasn't going to leave until she got answers. Please tell me, where did you learn to play? Other people were gathering around now too. An older gentleman with kind eyes. A teenage boy who'd been on his phone a minute ago. The director, Robert Chen, looking absolutely stunned. One of the reporters, still recording on her phone. They all wanted to know the same thing. Who was this woman they'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing? Margaret felt trapped. She'd spent 15 years being invisible, and now suddenly everyone was looking at her. Really looking at her, and she didn't know how to handle it. Her hands twisted together in her lap. She wanted to get up and leave, to go back to being nobody, but her legs wouldn't move. Please, the woman in the blue sweater said again, more gently this time. We want to understand. Something in her voice, the genuine kindness in it, made Margaret's resistance crumble. Maybe it was time. Maybe after 50 years of carrying this alone, it was time to tell someone. She took a shaky breath. I went to the conservatory, she said quietly. A long time ago. I had a scholarship. I was going to be a concert pianist. The words felt strange in her mouth, like speaking a foreign language. My teacher said I was good. They said I could have a career. What happened? Someone asked. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. My mother got sick. Cancer. I had to drop out to work and help pay for her treatment. She died 2 years later, and by then my scholarship was gone. I couldn't go back. So I just didn't. I haven't played in 50 years, not until today. The silence that followed was heavy. People looked at each other, then back at her. The woman in the blue sweater put her hand over her mouth. The older gentleman closed his eyes like he was in pain. Even the teenage boy looked moved, like he was suddenly seeing something real and true in a way he hadn't expected. 50 years, someone breathed. You gave it all up to take care of your mother. Margaret nodded. She was all I had. There wasn't really a choice. And you've been cleaning here for 15 years. Robert Chen said slowly, like he was putting pieces together. I've said hello to you almost every day, and I never knew. None of us knew. That's because nobody asks the cleaning lady about her life, Margaret said, not unkindly. Just stating a fact. I'm part of the background. I understood that. It was okay. But it clearly wasn't okay to the people listening. The woman in the blue sweater was crying even harder now. "I've complained about my piano lessons," she said, her voice breaking. "I've whined about practicing, about how hard it is, about how I don't have enough time. And you've been here, you've had this incredible gift, and you gave it up for love. You sacrificed everything." She looked at Margaret with something like awe. "You're one of the most beautiful people I've ever met." Margaret didn't know what to say to that. She'd never thought of herself as beautiful or special or anything like that. She'd just done what needed to be done, like millions of other people do every day. Nothing heroic about it. Just life. But as she looked at the faces around her, she saw something that surprised her. They were all crying, or close to it. The older gentleman was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. The teenage boy had his arms crossed tight across his chest like he was trying to hold something in. Even Robert Chen looked shaken, his usual professional composure completely gone. "I think," said the older gentleman slowly, "that a lot of us are crying for our own dreams right now. The things we gave up or walked away from or just let slip through our fingers." He smiled sadly. "You're reminding us of something we'd forgotten. Or maybe something we've been trying not to think about." A younger woman spoke up from the back of the small crowd. "I wanted to be a writer. I wrote every day in college. But then I got a practical job and I just stopped. I tell myself I'm too busy, but really I think I'm just scared. Scared I won't be good enough. Scared I wasted the years I could have been doing it." "I wanted to travel," said someone else. "Really travel. Not just vacations, but live in different places, see the world. But it seemed irresponsible. So I stayed, and now I'm 53 and I've barely left this state." One by one, people started sharing. Dreams of being an artist, a dancer, a teacher, a doctor, a chef. Dreams they'd put aside for practical reasons or fear, or because life got in the way. And as they talked, Margaret realized something. Her story had opened a door. By being vulnerable, by letting them see her pain and her loss, she'd given them permission to look at their own. The reporter with the phone stepped forward. She was a young woman, maybe 25, with bright eyes and quick movements. "I've been recording this whole thing," she said. "Your performance and now this conversation. I work for the local online news site. Would you mind if I shared this?"
I think a lot of people need to hear this story. Margaret's first instinct was to say no.
The thought of strangers watching her, judging her, seeing her cry at that piano made her stomach turn over. But then she looked at the faces around her. These neighbors who'd walked past her for 15 years without really seeing her. They were seeing her now, really seeing her. And instead of judgment, there was connection, understanding, love even. "Okay," she said softly, "if you think it might help someone." The reporter smiled and nodded, already typing on her phone. "I'll post it tonight. Just the video of you playing and maybe a short caption about your story. Is that all right?" Margaret agreed, though she couldn't imagine why anyone outside this room would care about an old cleaning lady playing a broken piano. Robert Chen crouched down next to the piano bench, looking at Margaret with new eyes. "I've been beating myself up about having to close this center," he said, "feeling like I failed everyone. But maybe," he paused thinking, "maybe this isn't really an ending. Maybe it's something else." "What do you mean?" the woman in the blue sweater asked. "I don't know yet," Robert admitted, "but something just happened here. Something important. And I don't think we should let it just fade away." People nodded, though no one was quite sure what he meant. The gathering slowly started to break up, people drifting back to their conversations. But everything felt different now, changed. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from sadness about an ending to something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Margaret sat at the piano for a long time after most people had moved away. Her hands rested on the keys, not playing, just touching them. The woman in the blue sweater stayed with her, sitting quietly in the folding chair like she was keeping watch, like she was making sure Margaret knew she wasn't invisible anymore. "Thank you," the woman finally said, "for sharing that, for playing, for being brave." Margaret looked at her, this stranger who'd somehow become something more in the space of half an hour. "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm just old and tired, and this place was closing anyway." "That's exactly when it's hardest to be brave," the woman replied. "When you have nothing left to lose and everything to lose at the same time." She stood up and offered her hand. "My name is Patricia, by the way, and I'm going to come back here before the center closes. I want to talk to you more. Margaret shook her hand, feeling the warmth of another person's touch, something she'd experienced so rarely over the years. Okay, she said. I'd like that. That night, Margaret went home to her small apartment and made herself dinner like always. But she couldn't stop looking at her hands. These hands that had remembered. These hands that still knew how to make music after 50 years of silence. She sat at her little kitchen table and cried for a long time. But it wasn't the same kind of crying as at the piano. This was different. This was release. She went to bed thinking the day was over, that tomorrow everything would go back to normal for the few remaining weeks the center stayed open. She had no idea that while she slept, a video was beginning to spread across the internet. A video of a simple woman at a broken piano. A video that would change everything. Margaret woke up the next morning to the sound of her phone ringing. This was unusual because her phone almost never rang. She had no family to call her, only a few acquaintances who might text once in a while to say hello. She picked it up confused and saw it was Robert Chen, the center director. Margaret, he said, and his voice sounded strange. Excited maybe, or shocked. Have you been online this morning? Have you seen what's happening? Online? Margaret said, still groggy from sleep. No, I just woke up. What's going on? The video, Robert said. The one from yesterday. The reporter posted it last night, and Margaret, it's everywhere. Everywhere. You've been viewed over 2 million times. Margaret sat up in bed, her heart suddenly pounding. What? That's not possible. It is possible, and it's happening. People are sharing it all over social media. The comments are incredible. Everyone's talking about you. About your story. About the music. You need to see this. After she hung up, Margaret's hands shook as she tried to find the video on her old laptop. She wasn't very good with technology, but eventually she managed to locate it. And there she was, sitting at that broken piano, tears streaming down her face, her fingers moving across the keys. The reporter had written a caption explaining her story. A woman who gave up her dreams to care for her dying mother, who hadn't played piano in 50 years. Playing one last time in a community center that was closing down. The view counter kept changing as she watched, the numbers climbing higher and higher. The comments went on forever. People from all over the world writing in different languages, all saying similar things. I'm crying at my desk at work, someone wrote. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. This woman deserves everything, wrote another. Someone please tell me how we can help her. I gave up painting 15 years ago, and watching this made me go find my old brushes, said someone else. Thank you for reminding me what matters. Margaret read comment after comment, unable to process what was happening. How could so many people care about her? She was nobody, just an old cleaning lady who played a broken piano. But as she kept reading, she started to understand. People weren't just responding to the music. They were responding to the story, to the sacrifice, to the 50 years of silence, to the idea that it's never really too late, that beauty can come from broken things, that invisible people matter. Her phone rang again. Then again. Then again. Robert calling with updates. Patricia, the woman in the blue sweater who'd somehow gotten her number. The mayor's office. A local television station asking if she'd come on their morning show. It was overwhelming. Margaret turned off her phone and just sat there, trying to breathe, trying to understand how her entire life had changed overnight. By the afternoon, there was a crowd gathered outside the community center. News vans, reporters with cameras, people holding signs that said, "Save the center and we love you, Margaret." When she arrived for her shift, still planning to clean because that was her job, people started clapping. Someone asked for her autograph. It was surreal, like living in a dream that didn't quite make sense. Robert pulled her aside, his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. Margaret, listen to me. Something incredible is happening. A fundraising campaign was started this morning. Someone set it up online to save the community center. They set a goal of $50,000. Do you know how much has been raised so far? Margaret shook her head, unable to speak. $230,000. And it's still climbing. Every few minutes more donations come in. People want to save this place. Because of you. Because of what you did yesterday. Margaret felt like her legs might give out. She sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs. I don't understand, she whispered. I just played a song. You did more than that, Robert said gently. You reminded people what community means, what art means, what it means to be human and vulnerable and brave. You gave people hope. Over the next few days, the story grew bigger. Margaret was interviewed by newspapers and television stations. Musicians from around the world reached out, offering support and expressing admiration for her talent. One famous pianist even said in an interview that he was humbled by her performance, that she'd played with more genuine emotion than he'd heard in years of professional concerts. But the most meaningful thing happened a week later. Patricia called Margaret and asked her to come to the community center for a special meeting. When Margaret arrived, she found the main hall packed with people. Not just neighbors, but representatives from local businesses, city council members, music teachers, and people she'd never met before. Robert stood at the front of the room and smiled at her. Margaret, we wanted you to be here for this announcement. Thanks to the fundraising campaign, we've not only saved the community center, we've exceeded our wildest expectations. We've raised over $400,000. The room erupted in applause. Margaret felt tears coming again. She seemed to cry a lot these days. But that's not all, Robert continued. We've had an anonymous donor come forward with an additional contribution. They're paying to restore the piano you played, and they want to add a permanent plaque dedicating it in your honor. More applause. Margaret couldn't stop the tears now. And there's one more thing, Patricia said, standing up and coming to the front. Some of us have been talking. We know you've been teaching yourself to play again this past week. We've seen you at the center after hours practicing. Margaret, we'd like to invite you to give a concert. A real concert. Not on that broken piano, but on a beautiful grand piano that a local music store has agreed to loan us. 1 month from now, a benefit concert for the community center, with you as the featured performer. Margaret's hands went to her mouth. A concert. A real concert. Like the one she'd imagined giving 50 years ago before everything changed. She thought about saying no, about explaining that she wasn't ready, that she was too old, that she'd forgotten too much. But then she looked at all these faces, these people who had seen her and heard her and decided she mattered, and she thought about that 17-year-old girl who'd dreamed of playing in concert halls, of sharing her music with the world. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, I'll do it. The month that followed was intense. Margaret practiced every day, sometimes for hours. Her fingers were stiff and sore at first, but slowly, steadily they remembered. Patricia came to listen sometimes, and other people too. The teenage boy from the farewell gathering started taking piano lessons and asked if he could watch her practice to learn. She said yes. Being watched while she played was still uncomfortable, but she was learning to accept it. Learning that sharing her gift was actually more fulfilling than hiding it. Local music teachers volunteered their time to help her prepare. One older man, a retired professor from a music college, worked with her on technique and interpretation. You have something rare, he told her. Technical skill can be taught, but what you have, that emotional depth, that authenticity, that only comes from having lived a real life. From having experienced real loss and real joy. The night of the concert arrived. The community center was transformed. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. The local news was there, broadcasting live. But more importantly, her neighbors were there. The people she'd cleaned for all these years. Patricia in the front row, the teenage boy with his family, Robert Chen, even the mayor. When Margaret walked onto the small stage in her simple black dress, the applause was deafening. She sat at the beautiful grand piano, so different from the broken upright she'd played that first day, and looked out at the crowd. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, really seen. She placed her hands on the keys, and for a moment she could feel her mother's presence, as if she were sitting in the back row like she used to at the conservatory. She could hear Dr. Lin's voice encouraging her. She could feel all the years of silence and all the years still to come, all of it converging in this single moment. Margaret began to play, not the Moonlight Sonata this time, but a piece by Chopin. Bright and triumphant and full of life. Her fingers flew across the keys, sure and strong, making music that filled the room and spilled out into the street beyond. And as she played, she realized something that made her smile through her tears. She'd spent 50 years thinking her dreams had died. But dreams don't die. They wait, they hibernate. They live quietly inside us until the moment is right for them to wake up again. And sometimes, when we least expect it, broken things, broken pianos, broken dreams, broken hearts, can make the most beautiful music of all. When the final note faded, the room exploded with applause. People were standing, clapping, crying, celebrating not just her music but the reminder that it's never too late. That sacrifice matters, that every person has a story worth hearing, that the invisible people around us might be carrying more beauty than we can imagine. Margaret stood and bowed, and for the first time in 50 years she felt complete. The girl she'd been and the woman she'd become were finally one person again. And in that moment she understood that she hadn't lost those years. She'd lived them, every single one, and they'd made her music richer, deeper, more true. The community center stayed open, thriving more than ever. The piano was restored and now bore